"This is my cabin, and you ladies need to get out right now." Gary Thompson wasn't the kind of man who raised his voice often. But that day, he did. His voice cracked with anger as Karen and her 3 wine club friends tore through his lakeside cabin, the one he had spent 5 years saving to build, the one meant to be a sanctuary for his family. They laughed as they flipped chairs, smashed decorations, and spilled cheap red wine across the wooden floors Victoria had spent hours polishing. The scent of spilled alcohol mixed with the faint burn of a candle they had knocked over, staining the air with the sharp tang of chaos. Karen, with her bleach, blonde curls and a bright red jacket that seemed almost like a badge of her arrogance, stood in the middle of the wreckage, wine glass in hand, smirking as she watched Gary's rage simmer. Her eyes sparkled with a cruel kind of amusement, as if other people's pain was the highlight of her day. Outside the window, the lake rippled under a gray autumn sky, pine branches swayed in the breeze, and the world should have been quiet. It should have been one of those weekends where Victoria sat on the porch reading a book, Jake washed his Ducati with teenage pride, and Gary prepared the fire pit to grill fish for dinner. But Karen didn't care about quiet weekends. She had shown up, claiming it was an HOA compliance check. But what followed was nothing short of a drunken invasion, turning the quiet cabin into a battlefield of laughter, smashed glass, and spilled wine. Standing in the middle of it all, Gary clenched his fists, feeling his heart pound painfully in his chest, fear mixing with fury. How was he supposed to protect his family from Karen? The HOA president who claimed she was protecting community standards, yet seemed to thrive on tearing people's lives apart when it suited her power. And then Karen did what people like her always do when they sense they're about to lose control. She pulled out her phone, dialed the police, and spun a story about Gary attacking HOA officials, her smirk returning as sirens echoed faintly in the distance. What Karen didn't know was that Victoria, the quiet woman sitting on the porch just moments earlier, was about to turn her entire world upside down and make Karen regret crossing this family forever. There was one thing Gary cherished above all else: those quiet mornings at Maplewood Estates. Sunlight would slip through the pines, casting gentle shadows across the porch where Victoria would sit with a book in her lap, while Jake, barely 17, wiped down his cherry red Ducati Scrambler, pride shining in his eyes with every soft purr of its engine. Maplewood Estates felt like a tiny American dream carved out of the chaos of the world. Brick-paved sidewalks, lawns trimmed with near-military precision, white fences that lined up like soldiers on parade. It was the kind of place where the biggest neighborhood drama might be someone putting their trash out a day early. Gary believed it was the safest place for Victoria and Jake to live a quiet life. But then Karen arrived. Karen, with her perfectly curled blonde hair and eyes sharp as cut glass, always wore a smile that never reached her eyes. As the self-appointed queen of the HOA, Karen believed she had the right to watch everything and everyone. It didn't take long before Gary's family and Jake's beloved Ducati were caught in her gaze. That afternoon, as Jake rolled in from work and parked his Ducati in their designated spot, Karen was watching. From the window across the street, she hovered like a hawk over prey, her perfectly manicured hand tugging the curtain back, just enough for her to see everything. And then she started taking pictures. Click, click, click. Her phone captured every angle: the license plate, the angle of the bike, the exact spot it was parked. She even zoomed in on Jake's reflection in the tank, documenting every harmless detail as if it were evidence in a criminal investigation. Jake, helmet still under his arm, glanced across the street, caught Karen's eyes behind the glass, and shrugged. At 17, he didn't realize that Karen's silence was not peace. It was the calm before a storm. Later that night over dinner, Gary told Victoria about Karen's strange surveillance, expecting irritation or worry. Victoria simply gave a small, knowing smile, a glint of steel in her gaze as she cut her food with quiet precision. "Let her put on her little show," she said calmly. "We'll see how far Karen wants to take this." The way she said it sent a chill down Gary's spine. Not because he was afraid of Karen, but because, for the first time, he realized Victoria was not the quiet, unassuming woman she appeared to be. And as Victoria predicted, Karen didn't stop with the photos. Soon, Karen began sending lengthy HOA emails to the entire neighborhood, warning about the dangers of motorcycles in family communities, cloaking her power games under the guise of protecting community standards. She even showed up at Gary's door, HOA notice in hand, with a sickly sweet smile that couldn't hide the threat in her eyes. Nobody in Maplewood Estates had ever dared to stand up to Karen. But Karen didn't know one thing. Victoria was not just a quiet woman with a book on the porch, and the storm Karen was sending toward Gary's family. Karen was about to pay the price for it. Karen always knew how to turn something small into a neighborhood spectacle. That morning, Gary was brewing his coffee when he heard the screech of brakes outside. Peering through the cabin window, he froze as two police cruisers pulled up in front of the cabin, red and blue lights flashing across the quiet streets of Maplewood Estates, tearing through the peace like a knife. Across the street, Karen stood on her lawn, arms folded, phone in hand, whispering into her camera as if live streaming to her personal HOA army, her blonde curls bouncing with every self-satisfied nod. Gary stepped outside, heart pounding as two officers exited their vehicles. One was older, gray at the temples with the calm demeanor of a man who had seen too much. The other was young, his crisp uniform and eager posture revealing how new he was to the job. "Are you Gary Thompson?" the older officer asked, flipping open a small notebook with professional efficiency. Gary nodded, trying to keep his voice steady despite the adrenaline spiking in his veins. The officer explained they'd received a complaint about excessive noise and illegal vehicle parking, accusations that made Jake's Ducati sound like a threat to the community. Gary nearly laughed. Jake, 17 years old, with his cherry red Ducati parked perfectly within the property line, was the furthest thing from a menace. At that moment, Jake stepped out onto the porch, still wearing his riding gloves, confusion and worry on his face as he saw the officers inspecting his bike. Across the street, Karen's phone was aimed directly at them, her eyes shining with anticipation, the smirk on her lips saying it all she believed she was winning. But then the cabin door opened, and Victoria stepped out. She was dressed simply in jeans and a crisp white blouse, her hair pulled back neatly. But there was something about the way she moved that shifted the air around her. She didn't speak immediately. She simply walked over to stand beside Gary, turning to face the officers, extending her hand for a handshake with a calm authority that was impossible to ignore. What happened next would be etched into Gary and Jake's memories forever. The older officer straightened, almost snapping to attention, his eyes sharpening. "Good morning, Colonel Thompson," he said, his voice filled with unmistakable respect. Everything went silent. Gary turned, staring at Victoria. Jake froze, eyes wide, helmet dangling from his hand. Across the street, Karen's phone slowly lowered, her confident smile collapsing into a look of confusion and fear. "Colonel," Karen whispered, her mouth moving but no sound coming out, her eyes wide as the reality sank in. Victoria nodded slightly, her calm gaze locking with Karen's across the street, not a hint of fear in her eyes. Jake looked up at his mother, realizing for the first time that the quiet woman who read on the porch was someone entirely different. The officers quickly completed their check on Jakey's Ducati, measuring sound levels, verifying its parking position, and finding everything perfectly legal. The younger officer even complimented Jake on maintaining his bike so well and respecting community rules. Karen, still standing across the street, watched as the officers returned the documents to Gary, shook Victoria's hand again, and called her Colonel one more time before leaving. In that moment, Karen realized that her little power games were over. Because Victoria wasn't just Gary's wife or Jake's mother. She was someone Karen should never have crossed, and Karen was about to pay the price. Karen was not the type to accept defeat, especially after being publicly humbled by a woman she once assumed was just a quiet housewife. 2 days after the police left without issuing a single citation, Karen launched her counterattack. She sent an email to every resident in Maplewood Estates titled "Urgent HOA Meeting to Preserve Community Standards." The language was carefully chosen, filled with emotional triggers, accusing Gary's family of disrupting neighborhood peace and threatening community safety. Karen didn't stop there. She began knocking on doors, clipboard in hand, gathering signatures on a petition demanding a ban on motorcycles in the neighborhood and stricter enforcement of HOA rules to protect families. That afternoon, as Gary pulled into the driveway, he saw Karen standing on Mr. Martinez's porch, gesturing toward their cabin, her voice low but insistent. Neighbors glanced over with wary eyes, whispers following Gary as he stepped out of the car. The once friendly air in Maplewood Estates was shifting. That evening, Victoria sat at the kitchen table, calmly reading through Karen's manipulative emails. Each word had been chosen to instill fear, to pit neighbors against each other. She's trying to control them through fear. Victoria said softly, her voice steady. "And she thinks this will make us back down." Gary looked at her, noticing the calm, unshakable resolve in her eyes. In that moment, he knew Karen had chosen the wrong opponent. When the HOA meeting day arrived, Karen turned the community center into her personal courtroom. She stood at the front, dressed in a navy blazer and pearl necklace, flanked by a laptop and oversized poster boards showing Jake's Ducati with bold red letters. Aidanjar or comme UI. Around 40 residents showed up, many with wary concerned faces, the room filled with tension. Karen began with a long-winded speech about values, safety, and community standards, dramatically pointing to photos of Jake's parked motorcycle, claiming it was improperly positioned, too noisy, and a threat to children's safety. Every word was crafted to stoke fear, to make neighbors question what was truly happening on their quiet streets. Karen was in her element, relishing the control she felt as residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Then the door opened. Victoria walked in. She wore the same simple jeans and white blouse, standing tall, her calm presence commanding the room without effort. She didn't need a microphone or a slideshow. Victoria simply said, "If we're going to talk about community safety, let's start with the facts." The room fell silent. Karen froze mid-sentence, color draining from her face, the rehearsed lines on her lips dying before they could leave her mouth. Victoria pulled a stack of papers from her bag, printed HOA regulations, boundary maps, noise ordinances, photos of Jake's Ducati parked precisely within legal lines, and most importantly, a police statement confirming that there were no violations whatsoever. Gary scanned the room, watching his eyes began to shift from Karen to Victoria. Mrs. White shook her head. The Martinez couple exchanged whispers, their eyes narrowing at Karen. Karen, still at the front, began to tremble, her confident posture faltering for the first time during the meeting. And this was only the beginning. Victoria knew Karen would retaliate, would fight to maintain her control. But Karen didn't realize she was no longer the one in control of this game. Karen was used to controlling people with fear. But she never expected that fear could come from the truth itself. After the HO meeting, Karen escalated her smear campaign. She sent emails accusing Victoria of threatening community freedom and silencing the voices of concerned residents. She even distributed flyers across Maplewood Estates, with a photo of Jake pushing his Ducati, bold letters screaming, "Danger lurks, who will be responsible when disaster strikes?" While Karen fueled paranoia, Victoria quietly prepared. Night after night, long after Jake had gone to bed, Victoria sat at the kitchen table under a warm lamp, reviewing spreadsheets and documents, speaking in low tones over the phone using terms Gary barely understood: internal audit, transaction mapping, contract verification. One evening, she looked at Gary and said calmly, "It's time they know the truth." Victoria sent out an invitation to all Maplewood Estates residents, titled simply, "Financial Truth Report for Every Resident's Protection." Karen laughed when she saw the email, thinking it was a desperate move. She had no idea Victoria had been investigating for 6 months. On the day of the meeting, the community room smelled of stale coffee and anxiety. Residents shuffled in, curiosity and unease on their faces. Karen walked in confidently, greeting neighbors sitting in the front row with a smirk. Victoria stepped forward, no projector, no flashy presentation. Only a single thick folder in her hand. "Good evening. I won't take much of your time," she said, her calm voice slicing through the tension. "I'm here to show you what has really been happening with your HOA funds for the past 4 years. She opened the folder, displaying clear bank statements, maintenance contracts, landscaping invoices, all highlighted and organized. "This is how much you have been paying for services, lawn care, playground maintenance, fence repairs. But nearly 40% of those funds were never used for their intended purpose." Victoria held up a contract showing 15,000 billed for playground repairs. She clicked to a photo on her phone, showing the rusted, broken playground equipment that had been untouched for over a year. "The company that was paid to fix this playground, it doesn't exist. It's a shell company with no real address." Victoria paused, letting the silence settle before looking directly at Karen. "And the person listed as the company's director." Karen's confident expression shattered. "It's a relative of Karen." The room fell completely silent, so quiet they could hear the ticking of the wall clock. Karen shot to her feet, her voice trembling. You're lying!" Victoria calmly held up an email confirmation of the payment, signed by Karen. "This is evidence." From the middle of the room, Mr. Gordon, the elderly HOA treasurer, stood up, eyes glistening. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "Karen threatened to have me removed if I didn't sign off on these payments. I didn't know how to stop her." Neighbors began to murmur, heads shaking, eyes turning toward Karen, eyes that once trusted her, now filled with anger and betrayal. Mrs. White's voice cut through the whispers. "I've paid my HOA dues for 10 years, always on time, only to find out you've been stealing from us." Victoria took a deep breath, her voice clear and strong. "I have already submitted this evidence to the State Financial Crimes Unit. They will handle the rest." Karen sank back into her chair, face pale, hands trembling as she clutched her purse. She realized everything she had built was collapsing. In that moment, Karen finally understood her real nightmare was never Jake's motorcycle. Her true nightmare was Victoria. Karen was unraveling. After Victoria exposed her financial fraud to the entire neighborhood, Karen's carefully crafted world of control shattered. She couldn't sleep, pacing her house late at night, calling every connection she had, begging for a way out. And in her desperation, Karen made a choice that would destroy her forever. She decided to frame Jake, Victoria's teenage son, hoping to turn the neighborhood against Victoria's family and regain control. Early one morning, as dew still clung to the grass, Karen crept into the driveway, glancing around nervously. She popped open the storage compartment of Jake's bright red Ducati, slipped a small bag of white powder inside, and quietly closed it, her eyes cold, calculating. Later that day, Karen made an anonymous call to the police, claiming suspicious drug activity at Gary's house and that she witnessed Jake making strange exchanges with shady people. Gary was just rinsing coffee cups when he heard the loud knock on the door. 2 officers stood there, warrant in hand. They moved to the Ducati, opened the compartment, and pulled out the bag of white powder. "Jake, you're going to need to come with us," the officer said. Jake's face drained of color, his body frozen as the reality sank in. Gary stood in shock, unable to form words. Victoria placed a steady hand on Jake's shoulder, but Gary noticed the tremor in her fingers. Her eyes, however, were clear, the eyes of a soldier facing an enemy. As Jake was driven away, Victoria didn't waste a moment. She opened her laptop, pulling up neighborhood security camera footage Gary had quietly collected over weeks. She scanned frame by frame until she found it. Karen, at 2:45 a.m., sneaking across their yard, opening the Ducati, placing the bag, and slipping away like a shadow. Victoria immediately sent the footage to Officer Rodriguez, the one who had saluted her before. Within 2 hours, Jake was released, fully cleared. The drugs were nothing but a mix of flour and sugar, staged to look like evidence. But it wasn't over. As Karen was gloating on Facebook Live, celebrating her victory, a loud knock came at her door. Her phone slipped from her hand as police entered. Karen was arrested for evidence tampering, filing false reports, obstruction of justice, and harassment. Neighbors watched as Karen, once the self-appointed queen of the HOA, was led away in handcuffs, her face pale, her screams echoing in the neighborhood. "I was protecting you." "They're the danger, not me." No one believed her anymore. From across the street, Victoria stood silently, her arms crossed, watching the woman who had terrorized the community finally face accountability. Gary, standing beside her, finally understood that every quiet evening Victoria spent reviewing documents, every calm phone call, every moment of stillness, was preparation to protect her family from a predator hiding behind the guise of community safety. As Jake stepped out of the police car, Victoria placed a hand on his shoulder. "No one has the right to threaten our family," she said softly. Jake nodded, tears in his eyes, looking at his mother with a newfound respect. For the first time, he saw her not just as a mom, but as a warrior who protected them all. Karen's arrest shook the entire neighborhood. Once the self-appointed queen of Maplewood Estates, Karen now sat alone in a cold holding cell, her reputation shattered, her future uncertain. She screamed that she only wanted to protect the community. But no one listened anymore. Her expensive lawyer tried to argue, but Victoria's evidence was too strong. Over 300,000 embezzled from HOA funds, fake maintenance companies tied to Karen's relatives, threats against elderly board members, and a staged drug setup against Jake. On the day of Karen's trial, the courtroom was packed with residents. Some came seeking justice, others simply to see the woman who had bullied them finally face consequences. Victoria entered calmly, wearing a simple suit, no military uniform, yet her quiet strength filled the room. She nodded respectfully at the prosecutor before taking her seat beside Gary and Jake. The key moment came when the prosecutor played the recorded call. Karen's own voice, arrogantly detailing how she had manipulated the HOA, framed Jake, and stolen community funds. Karen's face drained of color, her shoulders slumping as her own words sealed her fate. Tears rolled down her cheeks, not from remorse, but from the realization that the web of lies she spun for years was unraveling in front of everyone she once controlled. The judge sentenced Karen to prison time, restitution of all stolen funds, and a permanent ban from holding any community leadership role. Maplewood Estates residents erupted in quiet applause, tears, and sighs of relief. But Victoria wasn't there to celebrate. She stood and faced the community. This was never about revenge, she said, her voice steady. It was about protecting each other, about refusing to let fear silence us. The residents nodded. Mr. White wiped a tear. Mrs. Gordon squeezed her husband's hand. The Martinez family, who once stayed silent out of fear, now held their heads high. Jake looked at his mother, his eyes shining with a new respect. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered. Victoria smiled softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Remember, son, no one has the right to harm our family, or this community, not as long as we stand together." That evening, the sun set over Maplewood Estates, painting the sky in soft gold and lavender. Victoria sat on the porch with Gary, a warm cup of tea in her hand. They watched Jake carefully park his Ducati, the engine purring quietly before shutting off. For the first time in months, there was peace. Birds chirped in the distance, a gentle breeze rustled the trees, and the soft hum of families returning to normal life filled the air. Gary squeezed Victoria's hand. "You did it," he said quietly. Victoria shook her head with a small, tired smile. "No, we did it. Together." Across the street, neighbors were tending to their lawns, waving as they passed. Kids played on the sidewalks, laughing freely, unburdened by the fear Karen had spread. Victoria knew that this wasn't the end of challenges for Maplewood Estates. But it was a new beginning, one where the community understood that silence enables bullies, and that accountability is the only way forward. Jake stepped onto the porch, helmet under his arm. "Mom, Dad," he said, "want to go for a ride?" Victoria laughed softly. "Maybe tomorrow." As the last light of day faded, Victoria closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Karen was gone, but the lesson remained: courage isn't loud. It's quiet, patient, and unyielding. And sometimes it looks like a mother standing up for what is right, no matter the cost. The battle was over. The community was free. And for the first time in a long time, Victoria could finally rest, knowing she had protected what truly mattered. Thank you for watching this story. If it shocked you, hit like so more people can discover the truth behind HOA dramas like this one. Leave a comment below. What would you have done if Karen tried to frame your family? I read every comment. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next powerful, true story here on this channel. And if you made it to the end, type justice in the comments so I know you're part of the community that stands up for what's right. Remember, silence protects the bully. Courage protects the community. See you in the next story.